On the morning of October 14, 1907, a woman walked into the lobby of the Palmer House in Chicago wearing a coat that didn't belong to her. The desk clerk would later testify that she moved like someone who had forgotten how doors worked. She stood in the center of the marble floor for several minutes, turning slowly, as if the chandeliers and potted palms were objects from a distant century she was trying to remember. Her name was Clare Voss. She was 31 years old. She had been missing for 6 weeks. The clerk recognized her from the newspaper photographs that had circulated throughout September. He approached carefully, the way one approaches a sleepwalker. When he asked if she needed assistance, Clare looked at him with what he described as perfect comprehension and absolute removal. She asked for a room. She had no luggage. She paid in cash from an envelope she carried in her coat pocket. A man's coat, too large for her frame, smelling of wood smoke and something the clerk couldn't identify, but later called organic. Within the hour, 2 police detectives arrived at her door. Within 2 hours, her brother was on a train from Philadelphia. Within 3 days, every major newspaper from Boston to San Francisco had sent correspondents to Chicago, because Clare Voss was not just any missing woman. She was one of 5 people who had vanished from a scientific expedition into the Boundary Waters region of northern Minnesota in late August 1907. The expedition had been organized by the American Geographical Society. It was well-funded, meticulously planned, and led by Dr. Raymond Endicott, a respected geologist whose work on glacial formations had been published in 3 countries. Clare Voss was Dr. Endicott's assistant. She was also a trained botanist, one of the few women permitted into the field at that time, and she had joined the expedition to catalogue plant species in an area that remained, even then, largely unmapped. When she walked into the Palmer House that October morning, she was alone. The other 4 members of the expedition, Dr. Endicott, his graduate student Arthur Gill, the expedition's guide Samuel Toomey, and a surveyor named H.W. Marsh, were never seen again. Clare Voss refused to say what had happened to them, not refused in the theatrical sense. She didn't weep or faint or invoke God or plead for privacy. She simply looked at the detectives and said, in a voice one of them described as tired but not broken, that she would not be discussing the expedition. When pressed, she repeated the same phrase, "I won't be speaking about that." She said it the way one might decline a second serving of potatoes, politely, finally, without room for negotiation. The detective who interviewed her first, a man named Carrick, had been with the Chicago Police Department for 19 years. He had interviewed gunmen, arsonists, and women who had poisoned their husbands with arsenic-laced beef stew. He considered himself an excellent judge of when someone was lying. In his report, filed on October 16th, he wrote, "Subject demonstrates no physiological indicators of deception. Pulse steady, eye contact maintained. But subject is withholding information of material importance to a missing persons investigation. Subject exhibits what I would characterize as volitional silence." Volitional silence. The phrase appears again and again in the documents that survive from that autumn. Newspaper editors loved it. It suggested both mystery and agency. Clare Voss wasn't traumatized into muteness. She had chosen not to speak. Her brother, David, arrived from Philadelphia on the evening of the 14th. He was a banker, a widower, a man who valued exactness and protocol. He had raised Clare after their parents died in a ferry accident when she was 12. He had paid for her education at Bryn Mawr. He had written letters of recommendation when she applied to work with Dr. Endicott. In every photograph of David Voss that survives, he looks like a man who believes in the fundamental solvability of problems. He spent 3 hours with Clare on the night of his arrival. Afterward, he emerged from her hotel room and told the waiting journalists that his sister was recovering from a severe ordeal and would not be making any public statements. One reporter asked if she had been harmed. David paused before answering. "She is uninjured," he said. Then he returned to her room and didn't leave until morning. What he and Clare discussed that night was never recorded. But 2 days later, David Voss hired an attorney named Milton Schaefer, one of the most expensive criminal defense lawyers in Illinois. The public found this suspicious. The police found it illuminating. Clare Voss was not under arrest. She had committed no crime. But the hiring of Schaefer signaled something that the newspapers picked up on immediately. Clare Voss believed she needed protection, not from an external threat, but from the questions themselves. Schaefer was good at his job. Within a week, he had successfully argued that Clare could not be compelled to testify before a coroner's inquest until remains were found and an inquest was formally convened. Since no bodies had been recovered, no inquest could be held. Since no inquest could be held, Clare could not be subpoenaed. It was a perfect legal circle. The families of the missing men were furious. Dr. Endicott's widow, a former schoolteacher named Margaret, published an open letter in the Chicago Tribune on October 23rd. It was restrained and devastating. She did not accuse Clare of wrongdoing. She simply asked in 2 careful paragraphs why Clare would not help the families understand what had happened to the men they loved. "If there is innocence in Miss Voss's silence," Margaret Endicott wrote, "then let her demonstrate it. If there is shame, let her confess it. But to say nothing, to walk back into the world as if 4 men have simply evaporated like morning fog, is cruelty of a kind I cannot fathom." Clare did not respond. When a journalist managed to intercept her outside her hotel 3 days later, Clare looked at him with what he described as extraordinary calm and said, "I have nothing to add." She was wearing the same borrowed coat. Her hair, which had been cut short at some point during the 6 weeks she was missing, was beginning to grow back unevenly. The journalist noted that her hands, which she kept in her coat pockets, shook constantly. David Voss moved her out of the Palmer house on November 1st. He took her back to Philadelphia, to the brownstone where they had grown up. And as far as the public record shows, Clare Voss never spoke publicly again. The newspapers eventually moved on. The families did not. For the next 3 years, private investigators hired by the Endicott and Gill families combed through the Boundary Waters. They found the expedition's base camp abandoned but intact. They found equipment, notebooks, food stores. They found no human remains. They found no signs of violence. They found, in Dr. Endicott's field journal, entries dated up to September 3rd, 1907. Unremarkable observations about soil composition and weather patterns. The final entry read, "Gill and Marsh scouting Eastern Ridge, Toomey preparing evening meal, CV compiling botanical notes, expect to move camp north tomorrow if weather holds." The journal ended mid-page, as if Endicott had simply put down his pen and walked away. Clare Voss lived quietly in Philadelphia for the rest of her life. She never married. She never returned to field work. She took a position as a cataloger at the Academy of Natural Sciences, a job that required no interaction with the public and minimal conversation with colleagues. She was described by those who worked with her as perfectly competent and entirely self-contained. She attended Quaker meeting on Sundays. She kept a small garden. She read extensively. In 1909, a young journalist named Paul Deaver convinced David Voss to allow him a single interview with Clare for a retrospective piece he was writing on unsolved disappearances. David agreed, provided Deaver sign a contract stating he would ask no questions about the expedition itself. Deaver, desperate for access, agreed. The interview took place in the parlor of the Voss home on a February afternoon. Deaver's notes from that meeting survive in the archives of the Historical Society of Pennsylvania. They are brief and, in their own way, more revealing than a full confession would have been. Deaver asked Clare about her current work at the Academy. She answered in short, precise sentences. He asked about her botanical interests. She listed several species she found noteworthy. He asked if she missed fieldwork. She said she did not. Then, perhaps unable to resist, Deaver asked a question that technically did not violate his contract. "Miss Voss, do you ever think about the expedition?" Clare looked at him for a long time. Deaver wrote that her expression did not change, but something in her posture shifted, as if she had briefly decided whether to leave the room. Finally, she said, "Every day. Does it bring you pain to think about it?" Deaver asked. "Yes," Clare said. "Would it bring you relief to speak about it?" Clare folded her hands in her lap. "No," she said. It would not. That was the end of the interview. Clare Voss died in 1954, at the age of 78. She left behind no diaries, no letters that mentioned the expedition, no deathbed confession. Her estate was modest. She bequeathed her books to the Academy, her savings to a scholarship fund for women in the sciences, and a single sealed envelope to her brother's grandson, a man named Peter Voss, with instructions that it was not to be opened until the year 2000. Peter Voss opened the envelope in January of 2000, 46 years after Clare's death. Inside was a single sheet of paper. On it, in Clare's handwriting, were 4 words. I kept them safe. No explanation, no context, just that. The surviving families, by then scattered and diminished by time, had no idea what it meant. Neither did historians. Neither perhaps did Clare herself by the time she wrote it. But it stands as the only statement Clare Voss ever made about what happened in the Boundary Waters in the autumn of 1907. And it raises more questions than it could ever answer. To understand the silence, one must first understand what was lost. Dr. Raymond Endicott was 46 years old in the summer of 1907. He had been mapping glacial deposits in the Northern Territories for nearly 2 decades, and his reputation within the American Geographical Society was formidable. Colleagues described him as meticulous, patient, and deeply uninterested in personal glory. He published his findings in dense academic journals that almost no one read. He did not seek funding for grand expeditions or politically fashionable surveys. He simply went into the wilderness, measured things, and wrote down what he found. His wife Margaret once said, in a letter to her sister, that Raymond could spend an entire evening describing the mineral composition of a single stone and never once realize he'd forgotten to ask about her day. It was not a complaint. Margaret understood what she had married. She called him the gentlest obsessive I have ever known. Endicott had been planning the Boundary Waters expedition for 3 years. The area, straddling the U.S. Canadian border in what is now northern Minnesota, was one of the last unmapped regions in the upper Midwest. The terrain was difficult, dense forest, countless lakes, and bog systems that could swallow a man whole if he stepped wrong. But Endicott believed the region held clues to glacial movement patterns that could reshape existing theories about the last ice age. He needed a team. Arthur Gill was the obvious first choice. Gill was 28, a graduate student at the University of Chicago, and had spent 2 previous summers assisting Endicott in the field. He was bright, physically capable, and shared Endicott's preference for careful documentation over dramatic discovery. Gill's letters home to his mother, preserved in the Newbury Library, reveal a young man of almost paralyzing sincerity. He wrote in long, earnest paragraphs about soil types and compass bearings and the importance of contributing to the edifice of human knowledge. His mother saved every letter. After he vanished, she read them aloud to visitors as if the act of repetition might summon him back. Samuel Toomey was the expedition's guide. He was 52. A French-Canadian trapper who had spent most of his adult life in the woods between Minnesota and Ontario. He spoke fractured English and fluent Ojibwe. He knew the Boundary Waters better than any white man alive, which was exactly why Endicott hired him. Toomey was not a man who wrote letters or kept journals. What we know about him comes from the testimony of people who had worked with him before. Traders, surveyors, missionaries. They all said the same thing. Toomey was competent, quiet, and absolutely reliable. He did not drink, he did not gamble. He showed up when he said he would, did the job he was paid to do, and disappeared back into the woods until the next job. One trapper, a man named Alastair Drummond, told an investigator in 1908 that Toomey once guided a party through a blizzard so severe that 3 men lost fingers to frostbite, and Toomey himself walked away without a scratch. He had a relationship with the cold, Drummond said, like they'd come to an understanding. The 4th member was H.W. Marsh, a surveyor from Duluth. Marsh was 34, married, and had 2 sons under the age of 5. He had been hired specifically for his skill with cartographic instruments and his experience working in remote terrain. Colleagues described him as businesslike and unremarkable, a man who did not seek adventure, but tolerated it when the pay was good. Marsh's wife, Eleanor, testified before a private investigator in 1909 that her husband had been reluctant to join the expedition. He'd taken the job, she said, because Endicott's funding was generous and the family needed money to move into a larger house. The night before he left, Marsh told Eleanor he'd be back by October 1st. He made her write it on the calendar. He said he didn't like the idea of being in the Boundary Waters once the weather turned. He wasn't a nervous man, Eleanor testified, but he didn't like the woods. He said they made him feel watched. And then there was Clare. Clare Voss had met Dr. Endicott in 1904 at a lecture he gave at Bryn Mawr on glacial botany. She was in her final year of study, one of only 6 women in the natural sciences program. After the lecture, she approached him with a question about lichen colonization patterns on post-glacial rock. Endicott later told his wife that he was startled by the precision of the question, not because it came from a woman, but because it indicated someone who had been thinking about the problem in exactly the same way he had. He hired her as a research assistant 6 months later. Their working relationship was, by all accounts, entirely professional. Endicott treated Clare the way he treated Arthur Gill, as a junior colleague whose intelligence he respected and whose labor he needed. Clare catalogued plant samples, organized field notes, and drafted portions of Endicott's manuscripts. She was paid less than a male assistant would have been, but more than most women in similar positions. She never complained. Margaret Endicott, in a letter written to her sister in 1906, described Clare as one of those rare women who has no apparent need for social approval. She continued, "Raymond admires her for it. I find it unsettling. Not because I distrust her, she has been nothing but courteous to me, but because I cannot read her at all. She is like a house with all the curtains drawn." Still, Margaret approved of Clare joining the Boundary Waters expedition. She told Raymond that having another woman in the field might provide Clare with a sense of camaraderie, or at least mitigate the inevitable impropriety of being the only woman among 4 men in the wilderness. Raymond apparently found this reasoning unnecessary but didn't argue. The expedition departed from Duluth on August 12, 1907. They traveled by rail to Ely, Minnesota, then continued north by canoe into the lake country. The plan was to establish a base camp near the border, then conduct radiating surveys of the surrounding terrain over a 6-week period. They carried food for 8 weeks, in case weather delayed their return. They carried rifles in case of bears. They carried a typewriter because Endicott wanted to draft his preliminary findings while the observations were still fresh. In the days before they left, several photographs were taken. They survive in various archives. Stiff, formal images of 5 people standing beside stacked equipment. In every photograph, the 4 men are looking at the camera. Clare is looking slightly to the left, as if her attention has been caught by something just outside the frame. Samuel Toomey stands apart from the group. His expression is unreadable. One photograph shows Clare and Endicott standing side by side, both holding notebooks. Endicott is smiling. Clare is not. Someone later labeled the photograph Dr. E and assistant before departure. The handwriting is not Clare's. There is no evidence of tension among the group before they left. Gill's letters to his mother, written in the days leading up to departure, are full of excitement. Marsh sent a telegram to his wife from Ely. Weather fine, spirits high, home by October as promised. Endicott wrote to Margaret from the same location, assuring her that Toomey had secured excellent equipment and the route was well planned. Clare sent no letters, or if she did, they have not survived. The last confirmed sighting of the full expedition came on August 19th, when a trapper named Emil Kuronen encountered them on the portage between Knife Lake and Kekakabik Lake. Kuronen later testified that the group seemed orderly and well supplied. He spoke briefly with Toomey in French. Toomey told him they were headed northwest toward the unmapped lakes near the Canadian border. Kuronen warned him that the terrain was difficult and the weather was turning unpredictable. Toomey thanked him and said they would be careful. Kuronen watched them paddle away into the mist. He said that Clare seated in the middle of one canoe, turned and looked back at him just before they disappeared from view. He remembered thinking it was an odd gesture, not a wave, not a nod, just a look. Later, he would say it felt like she was memorizing his face. That was the last time anyone saw all 5 of them together. The timeline of the expedition's movements after August 19th is reconstructed from fragmentary evidence. Campfire sites found by search parties, abandoned equipment marked with dates, and the field journals left behind. They reached their intended base camp on August 23rd. The site was on a narrow peninsula jutting into a lake that appeared on no map. Toomey chose it, according to a note in Endicott's journal, because it offered good visibility and access to fresh water. The camp was established with standard efficiency, canvas tents arranged in a semicircle, food stores elevated to discourage animals, a fire pit dug and ringed with stones. Endicott's journal entries from late August describe routine scientific work. Gill and Marsh conducted surveys of the surrounding ridges. Toomey maintained the camp and set fishing lines. Clare collected plant specimens and sketched the local topography. The weather was good. Morale was stable. On August 28th, Endicott noted that Clare had discovered an unusual lichen formation on the north-facing rocks near the lakeshore, something she believed might be a previously unrecorded species. He wrote, "CV insists on cataloging the specimens properly before we move camp. I have agreed to delay departure by 2 days. Her thoroughness is commendable, if occasionally inconvenient." On September 1st, Gill and Marsh departed on a 3-day scouting expedition to map a series of lakes to the east. Endicott noted their departure and estimated they would return by September 4th. He wrote, "Gill is enthusiastic, perhaps excessively so. Marsh is steady. I trust them to stay within the agreed perimeter." On September 3rd, Endicott made his final journal entry. It is brief, unremarkable, and ends mid-page. After that, silence. The search parties, which began arriving in mid-September after the expedition failed to return to Ely as scheduled, found the base camp intact. The tents were still standing. Food stores remained, largely untouched. Clothing and personal effects were present. Endicott's journal lay open on a camp table, a pen resting in the fold between pages. What was missing? People. Canoes. 2 of them. Rifles. 3 of them. What was also missing? Any sign of panic, violence, or hurried departure. One of the search party leaders, a man named Garrett Pelletier, testified that the camp looked as if the occupants had simply stepped away for a few hours. He specifically noted that the fire pit contained logs arranged for burning but not yet lit, as if someone had intended to return and start a fire for the evening meal. Gill and Marsh's scouting route was traced using Marsh's preliminary survey maps, which had been left at the base camp. Searchers found their subcamp approximately 8 miles east, similarly abandoned. Marsh's surveying equipment was present. Gill's collection of rock samples was neatly arranged. Their tent was collapsed but not damaged. Toomey's rifle was found leaning against a tree near the base camp. It was loaded. The search parties worked for 6 weeks, combing the surrounding lakes and portages. They dragged sections of several lakes. They interviewed every trapper, missionary, and Ojibwe resident within a 50-mile radius. No one had seen anything. No one had heard anything. The official search was suspended on October 20th, a week after Clare Voss reappeared in Chicago. The question that consumed investigators, journalists, and the families was simple and unanswerable. What happened between September 3rd and October 14th? 41 days. Clare had walked out of the wilderness. The others had not. The physical evidence of Clare's journey, or survival, was minimal. When she arrived at the Palmer house, she was wearing a man's wool coat, which was later identified as similar to those worn by expedition members, but could not be definitively attributed to any of the missing men. Her own clothing beneath the coat was torn and stained with mud and what might have been blood, though laboratory analysis was inconclusive. Her boots were nearly destroyed, held together with improvised repairs made from bark and sinew. She had lost approximately 20 pounds. She had multiple bruises in various stages of healing, consistent with falling or moving through dense brush. She had a partially healed cut on her left palm that appeared to have been made by a sharp object, possibly a knife or broken glass. Her hair had been cut short with what a physician later determined was likely a dull blade, the cuts uneven and hasty. But she had no injuries suggesting violence from another person. No defensive wounds, no signs of restraint. The physician who examined her, Dr. Leonard Corbett, noted in his report that Clare was physically depleted but mentally coherent. He found her unusually calm for someone who had survived an ordeal in the wilderness. When he asked her if she had been harmed by anyone, Clare said no. When he asked her if she had harmed anyone, Clare looked at him and said, "I won't be speaking about that." Dr. Corbett wrote, "I cannot determine if subject's refusal to speak is born from trauma or from calculation." The police tried multiple approaches. Detective Carrick attempted sympathy. He told Clare that he understood she had been through something difficult, that no one was accusing her of wrongdoing, that the families simply needed closure. Clare listened politely and said nothing. A female police matron was brought in on the theory that Clare might feel more comfortable speaking to another woman. The matron, whose name was Agnes Howell, spent an afternoon with Clare and later reported that Clare was pleasant and distant, like a guest at a party she did not wish to attend. An attorney representing the Endicott family attempted a more aggressive stance, suggesting that Clare's silence implied guilt, if not of a crime, then of negligence or cowardice. Clare's response, delivered through her lawyer Milton Schaefer, was that she had no legal obligation to answer questions and would not be doing so. A minister was sent at the request of Margaret Endicott. He spent 2 hours with Clare, praying and asking gentle questions about faith and forgiveness. Afterward, he told Mrs. Endicott that Clare had been respectful but impenetrable. He said, "She is not avoiding God. She is avoiding us." The newspapers speculated endlessly. Some suggested that Clare had killed the men, perhaps in self-defense, perhaps not, and was protecting herself from prosecution. But no bodies were ever found, and Clare showed no signs of having been in a physical altercation with 4 grown men. The theory was dramatic, but implausible. Others suggested that Clare had abandoned the men when disaster struck. Perhaps they had fallen through ice, or been attacked by animals, or succumbed to disease, and her silence was born from shame. But the timeline made this unlikely. 41 days was too long to survive alone in the Boundary Waters without more severe physical consequences, and Clare's survival suggested skill and preparation, not panicked flight. A few newspapers, particularly those inclined toward sensationalism, suggested romantic entanglements, that Clare had been involved with one of the men, that jealousy had led to violence, that her silence protected a lover who had died. But everyone who knew the expedition members dismissed this immediately. Endicott was happily married. Gill was earnest to the point of priggishness. Marsh was devoted to his wife. Toomey barely spoke English, let alone engaged in romantic intrigue. And Clare, as Margaret Endicott had noted, seemed to have no interest in social approval at all, let alone romance. The most persistent theory, advanced by several investigative journalists, was that the group had encountered something, someone, that they should not have. Smugglers, perhaps, moving contraband across the Canadian border, or fugitives hiding in the wilderness. The theory went that the men had been killed to protect a secret, and Clare had been spared, or had escaped, and now feared retribution if she spoke. This theory gained traction when a journalist discovered that the area where the expedition had camped was not far from routes known to be used by bootleggers even before Prohibition. But Toomey would have known about such risks, and there was no evidence of anyone else in the region during that time. David Voss, in one of his rare public statements, dismissed all speculation. "My sister survived something that 4 men did not," he said. "Whatever that something was, she has chosen not to share it. I trust her reasons." When asked if he himself knew what had happened, David paused and said, "No." When asked if Clare had told him anything at all, David said, "She told me she was safe. That is all I need to know." But his hiring of Milton Schaefer suggested he knew more than he was willing to say. or feared more than he was willing to admit. In late November 1907, a Ojibwe trapper named Joseph Caribou came forward with information that briefly rekindled public interest. Caribou told authorities that in early September, he had seen smoke from a campfire in the area where the expedition had been. He had not approached, because he did not wish to intrude on white travelers. But he had watched from a distance, and he had seen figures moving around the fire. He could not say how many. He could not say if one of them was a woman. But he said he had heard singing. Not distressed singing, not the kind of sound people make when they are afraid. Just singing. A hymn, he thought, though he did not know the words. He said the sound had carried across the water in the evening air, and it had sounded peaceful. When investigators asked Caribou if he could identify when this had occurred, he said it was around the time of the new moon. In September 1907, the new moon fell on September 8th, 5 days after Endicott's final journal entry. This raised a question that no one could answer. If the group was still together and peaceful on September 8th, what happened after that? And if Clare was with them, singing hymns by the fire, why did she return alone? Caribou was asked if he had seen anything else. He said no. Then he paused and added, almost as an afterthought, that he had returned to the area a week later, and the camp was gone. Not abandoned, gone. The fire pit had been dismantled. The ground had been swept clean with pine branches. He said it looked as if someone had tried very hard to make sure no one would know they had been there. This detail was never satisfactorily explained. The pressure on Clare to speak did not ease. If anything, it intensified. In early 1908, Margaret Endicott began a letter-writing campaign. She sent letters to newspapers, to politicians, to the governor of Minnesota, to the president of the American Geographical Society. She did not accuse Clare of murder. She did not demand prosecution. She simply asked, again and again, for Clare to explain what had happened to her husband. "I do not seek vengeance," she wrote in one letter, published in the Boston Globe in March 1908. "I seek only knowledge. My husband was a good man. He deserves better than to be erased from the earth without explanation. If Miss Voss knows what became of him, whether he suffered, whether he is at rest, whether there is a place I might visit to mourn him, she owes it to his memory to speak." The letter was widely reprinted. It was eloquent and restrained, and it made Clare Voss look heartless by comparison. Clare did not respond. Arthur Gill's mother, Sarah, took a different approach. She traveled to Philadelphia and appeared unannounced at the Voss home in April 1908. David Voss answered the door. Mrs. Gill, a small woman in her 60s, asked to speak with Clare. David told her gently that Clare was not receiving visitors. Mrs. Gill began to weep on the doorstep. She told David that Arthur had been her only child, that she had no one left, that she just wanted to understand what had happened to her son. David Voss invited her inside. They spoke for over an hour. What was said between them is not recorded, but when Mrs. Gill left, she told a journalist who had followed her that David Voss was a decent man in an impossible position. She did not attempt to see Clare again. Later, in a letter to a friend, Mrs. Gill wrote, "Mr. Voss did not tell me what happened to Arthur, but he told me that Clare had not acted with malice. He said that sometimes the kindest thing we can do is not to know everything. I do not understand this. I do not accept it. But I believe he meant it." H.W. Marsh's widow, Eleanor, hired a private investigator named Thomas Henneman to re-examine the case. Henneman was a former Pinkerton agent with a reputation for solving cold cases. He spent 6 months reviewing evidence, interviewing witnesses, and exploring the boundary waters. In November 1908, he delivered a report to Eleanor that was never made public, but was summarized in a letter she later wrote to her sister. Henneman had concluded, Eleanor wrote, that Clare Voss had not killed anyone. He believed the men had died, probably from exposure, possibly from drowning, perhaps from an accident, and that Clare had survived through some combination of luck, skill, and ruthlessness. But he also believed that Clare knew where the bodies were and was choosing not to reveal their location. Why would she do that? Eleanor had asked him. Henneman's answer, as Eleanor recounted it, was, "Because she thinks it's better for everyone if they're not found." Eleanor found this unacceptable. She continued pressing for official investigation, but by 1909, the authorities had moved on. No new evidence had emerged, no bodies had been found, and Clare Voss, living quietly in Philadelphia, had become legally untouchable. In 1910, the American Geographical Society held a memorial service for Dr. Endicott and the members of the lost expedition. A plaque was commissioned, speeches were given, Clare Voss was invited. She did not attend. Margaret Endicott did attend. In her remarks, she spoke about her husband's dedication to science and his belief that knowledge was worth pursuing even at personal cost. She did not mention Clare by name, but at the end of her speech she said, "Raymond believed in the importance of truth. He would have wanted the truth to be known, no matter how painful. I hope that those who know that truth will someday find the courage to share it." The room was silent. A journalist later asked Margaret if she believed Clare Voss was a coward. Margaret considered the question and said, "No, I think she is something more complicated than that." Clare continued her work at the Academy of Natural Sciences. She was, by all accounts, an exemplary employee. She arrived on time. She completed her assignments without error. She spoke when spoken to and did not linger in conversation. Her colleagues found her competent and unremarkable. One colleague, a man named Ernest Whitfield, later wrote in a letter that Clare had once stayed late to help him organize a shipment of pressed flowers that had arrived in disarray. They worked in silence for nearly 2 hours. At one point, Whitfield made a comment about how tedious the work was. Clare looked at him and said, "I don't mind tedium. Tedium is safe." Whitfield wrote, "I didn't know what she meant at the time. Looking back, I think she meant it literally." Clare lived with her brother David until his death in 1923. After that, she moved into a small apartment near Rittenhouse Square. She had no close friends. She attended Quaker meeting but did not participate in the social activities. She read voraciously, history, poetry, botany. She kept a garden on her building's roof, where she grew medicinal herbs and native plants. In 1925, a young reporter named Catherine Lyle attempted to interview Clare for a retrospective piece on unsolved mysteries. Lyle managed to encounter Clare on the street by chance, or so she claimed, and asked if she could walk with her. Clare agreed. Lyle later published an account of the conversation in Harper's Magazine. She wrote that she did not ask Clare directly about the expedition. Instead, she asked her about her work, her garden, her reading. Clare answered in short, pleasant sentences. They walked for several blocks. Then, as they were about to part, Lyle said, "Miss Voss, do you think people have a right to know the truth?" Clare stopped walking. She looked at Lyle for a long moment. Then she said, "I think people have a right to many things, but not all truths are meant to be shared." "Why not?" Lyle asked. "Because some truths do more harm than good," Clare said. Then she wished Lyle a good day and walked away. Lyle wrote, "I do not know if Clare Voss is protecting herself, or protecting others, or protecting the dead, but I left that encounter convinced that she believes deeply that her silence serves a purpose. The families never accepted this." Margaret Endicott spent the rest of her life hoping for answers. She died in 1931, 24 years after her husband disappeared. In her will, she left a sum of money to be used as a reward for anyone who could provide definitive information about the fate of the expedition. The reward was never claimed. Arthur Gill's mother, Sarah, died in 1919. She never learned what happened to her son. Eleanor Marsh remarried in 1914. She told her second husband that she did not wish to discuss her first marriage, and as far as anyone knows, she never did. Samuel Toomey had no known family. No one mourned him publicly. But trappers in the Boundary Waters continued to speak of him for years, and the consensus was always the same. If Toomey had died out there, something very bad must have happened, because Toomey did not make mistakes. And Clare lived another 3 decades in quiet anonymity. She retired from the academy in 1945. She spent her final years reading, gardening, and attending meeting. She was, by all accounts, content. In 1952, a historian named Robert Landry, who was researching early expeditions in the Boundary Waters, wrote to Clare asking if she would be willing to be interviewed for an oral history project. He promised not to ask about the expedition itself, only about her experiences as a woman in field science during the early 1900s. Clare declined. In her brief reply, she wrote, "I appreciate your interest, but I have nothing to contribute to your project. My work was unremarkable, and my experiences were private. I wish you well in your research." Landry later told a colleague that the formality of Clare's refusal struck him as the politeness of someone who has spent a lifetime keeping people at a distance. Clare Voss died on March 12, 1954. She was 78 years old. The cause of death was heart failure. She died alone in her apartment. Her body was discovered by a neighbor who noticed that her mail had accumulated for several days. Her funeral was small. Fewer than a dozen people attended. David Voss's grandson, Peter, delivered a brief eulogy in which he described Clare as a woman of great integrity and quiet strength. He did not mention the expedition. Clare was buried beside her brother in West Laurel Hill Cemetery. Her headstone is simple: her name, her dates, and a single line from a Quaker hymn, "Let all mortal flesh keep silence." The families of the lost men did not attend the funeral. By then, most of them were gone. But Margaret Endicott's daughter, a woman named Ruth, sent a wreath. The card attached to it read, "For the one who knew." Peter Voss kept the card. He kept it for 46 years, until the day he opened the envelope Clare had left for him. Inside, as previously noted, was a single sheet of paper with 4 words: "I kept them safe." Peter Voss spent the rest of his life trying to understand what his great-aunt had meant. He never did. There are many ways to interpret Clare Voss's silence. Some have argued that she was protecting herself from prosecution for a crime she did or did not commit. But this theory requires believing that Clare was guilty of something so terrible that she preferred to endure decades of public suspicion rather than speak. And yet, no evidence of violence or wrongdoing ever emerged. The men simply vanished. Others have argued that Clare was protecting the reputation of one or more of the men. Perhaps something shameful had occurred: cowardice, betrayal, madness. Perhaps Clare believed that silence was a form of mercy, that letting the men be remembered as missing rather than flawed was a kindness to their families. But this theory assumes that Clare cared more about the dead men's reputations than about the living family's need for closure. And nothing in Clare's history suggests she was sentimental in that way. A third theory, advanced by several historians, is that Clare witnessed something so traumatic, perhaps the men dying slowly, horribly, unavoidably, that she could not speak of it without reliving it. This theory frames Clare as a victim of what we would now call post-traumatic stress, and her silence as a symptom rather than a choice. But Clare never exhibited other signs of trauma. She was functional, even thriving in her later life. Her silence did not seem to cost her peace. If anything, it seemed to grant it. And then there is the theory suggested by Clare's final message: "I kept them safe." Safe from what? From discovery? From judgment? From the world? The phrase is maddeningly ambiguous. It suggests agency. Clare kept them safe, meaning she acted with intention. But safe from what threat? And why would she need to keep them safe if they were already dead? Unless they weren't. This is the interpretation that haunts me as I write this, though I acknowledge it is speculative and unsupported by evidence. What if the men did not die in the Boundary Waters? What if they chose to disappear for reasons we cannot know, and Clare was the only one who returned to the world? What if she kept them safe by never revealing that they had chosen to vanish? But this raises more questions than it answers. Why would 4 men, respected, employed, loved, choose to abandon their lives? What could drive them to such a decision? And why would Clare agree to bear the weight of their secret? Or perhaps Clare's message meant something simpler. Perhaps the men did die, and Clare buried them somewhere she believed they should rest, and her silence was the only way to ensure they would not be disturbed. Perhaps "I kept them safe" meant I let them stay where they fell. But even this interpretation requires believing that Clare thought the family's grief mattered less than the dead men's peace, and nothing in Clare's character suggests she was cruel. The truth is, we do not know. We do not know what happened in the Boundary Waters in September 1907. We do not know why Clare Voss returned alone. We do not know what she saw, what she did, or what she chose. All we know is that she survived, and the others did not. And she chose silence over explanation for 47 years. And in that silence, she was unwavering. There is a particular kind of strength in that. The strength to endure suspicion, grief, anger, and incomprehension without yielding. Clare Voss was called a coward by some, a murderer by others, and a victim by a few. But she did not defend herself. She did not explain. She simply lived her life, quietly and completely, as if the weight of 4 missing men and 1,000 unanswered questions were not pressing on her shoulders every day. But of course they were. Paul Deaver, the journalist who interviewed her in 1909, wrote in his notes, "She thinks about it every day." And when he asked if speaking would bring her relief, she said no. What kind of burden requires silence to bear? What kind of truth is too heavy to share? I have spent years researching this case. I have read every document, interviewed every surviving relative, walked the portages where the expedition camped. I have stood on the shores of unmapped lakes and tried to imagine what Clare saw when she returned alone. And I have come to believe that Clare Voss's silence was not the absence of an answer. It was the answer. She chose not to speak because she believed, rightly or wrongly, that silence was the most protective, most merciful, most honorable choice available to her. Whether she was protecting herself, the dead, or the living, we cannot know. But she made a decision in the wilderness in 1907, and she spent the rest of her life honoring that decision with absolute fidelity. In 2003, a team of researchers using ground-penetrating radar and modern mapping technology conducted a survey of the area where the expedition had camped. They were hoping to find remains, equipment, anything that might provide closure. They found nothing. The wilderness had swallowed whatever had happened there, and it was not giving it back. Clare Voss would have approved. In the end, what we are left with is this: a woman who walked out of the woods alone, carrying a secret she would not share, and built a life in the shadow of that secret without complaint or collapse. She did not ask for understanding. She did not seek forgiveness. She simply existed fully and quietly until she died. And on her deathbed, or perhaps years before, in a moment of clarity or resignation, she wrote 4 words that explain nothing and suggest everything. I kept them safe. Safe from whom? Safe from what? We do not know. And because Clare chose silence, we never will. But I think, and this is only my interpretation, formed after years of study and speculation, that Clare Voss believed those 4 men were better off lost than found. She believed that whatever happened to them in the Boundary Waters should remain there, beyond the reach of grief and inquiry and justice. She believed that some stories are not meant to be told, and so she didn't tell it. For 47 years, she carried the weight of that choice, and when she finally set it down, she left behind only 4 words, which are both an answer and a refusal to answer. I kept them safe. The families wanted to know. The public wanted to know. History wanted to know. But Clare Voss had made a promise, to whom or what we cannot say, and she kept it, even unto silence, even unto the end. In 2007, on the 100th anniversary of the expedition's disappearance, the Historical Society of Minnesota organized a small memorial service at the edge of the Boundary Waters. A handful of descendants attended. A plaque was placed near the water, bearing the names of the 4 men who never returned: Raymond Endicott, Arthur Gill, Samuel Toomey, H.W. Marsh. Clare Voss's name was not on the plaque, but someone, no one knows who, had carved her initials into the bark of a nearby tree. Just 2 letters, CV, and beneath them 4 words, rough and uneven as if carved with a dull blade. I kept them safe. The tree still stands, the wilderness keeps its secrets, and Clare Voss, wherever she is, remains silent.